Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media. While we live in a fracturing society, launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum, I remain in the underclass. In 1976, a FOIA request from the New York Times uncovered the existence of an internal document published and circulated within the CIA in 1967. The title of the document was Countering Criticism of the Warren Report, and provided clear concerns as well as recommended actions in order to discredit the critics of the official report's findings in regard to the Kennedy assassination. In the memo, they resort to using the term conspiracy theories as a pejorative to undermine and dismiss any criticism of the official narrative, including, conspiracy theories have frequently thrown suspicion on our organization, for example, by falsely alleging that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for us. We do not recommend that discussion of the assassination question be initiated where it is not already taking place. Where discussion is active, however, addressees are requested: A. To discuss the publicity problem with liaison and friendly elite contacts, especially politicians and editors. Urge them to use their influence. B. To employ propaganda assets, book reviews, and feature articles are particularly appropriate for the purpose. This is the internal memo that many people point to as a smoking gun, unequivocally proving that the CIA purposefully popularized the term in order to facilitate a cover-up and deceptively discredit anyone who questioned the official line as a communist sympathizer who might as well be Lee Harvey Oswald. April 27, 1961, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, President John F. Kennedy addressed the American Newspaper Publishers Association.
I want to talk about our common responsibilities in the face of a common danger. The events of recent weeks may have helped to illuminate that challenge for some, but the dimensions of its threat have loomed large on the horizon for many years. Whatever our hopes may be for the future, for reducing this threat or living with it, there is no escaping either the gravity or the totality of its challenge to our survival and to our security. A challenge that confronts us in unaccustomed ways in every sphere of human activity. This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern, both to the press and to the President. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
Later in the very same speech, President Kennedy would continue urging members of the press and the general public to heed his warning, saying, "For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned. No rumor is printed. No secret is revealed. It conducts the Cold War, in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy would ever hope or wish to match. Nevertheless, every democracy recognizes the necessary restraints of national security, and the question remains whether those restraints need to be more strictly observed if we are to oppose this kind of attack as well as outright invasion. Today, we remove the shackles of censorship and concealment, reminding ourselves of the inherent opposition we were always meant to share against the unbridled authority of the ever-expanding national security state. As President Kennedy warned so many years ago, no war has been declared, yet our way of life is under attack. No war ever posed a greater threat to our society. In episode 13, we finally contend with the clear and present danger as we expose the sophisticated lies meant to cover up the dark reality of the murder of a president and the hostile takeover of an entire nation. How many special interests must align before we accept the direct implications of a much broader conspiracy? In our effort to cope with the destiny betrayed and the consequences of a traumatized generation, we devote an entire episode to exploring one of the most important unanswered questions in all of American history. Who really was Lee Harvey Oswald?
Here comes Oswald down the hall again.
Did you buy that rifle? That's as fast as you people have been given, but I emphatically deny these charges.
Oswald has hustled through a doorway.
Against the wall. Right, these people have given me a hearing without legal representation or anything. Did you shoot the president? I didn't shoot anybody, no, sir. I don't know what this is all about. You kill the president? No, sir, I didn't. Keep it down in the
Did you shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man! Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I live in the village. I'm just a patsy.
Here he comes. Now the prisoner wearing a white sweater is changed from his t-shirt.
Let me have it. I want it.
Being let out by Captain Fritz. There is the prisoner.
There is Lee. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun. It's absolute panic. Absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters. Detectives have their guns drawn. There is no question about it. Oswald has been shot at point-blank range, fired into his stomach.
He is shot.
He is shot. Oswald.
It is Oswald. You're was that the man that shot the man, or do you know?
That is the man that shot the man.
Imagine killing the president at 12:30 p.m. and then 5 minutes later, calmly having a conversation with a Dallas police officer in the lunchroom of the Texas School Book Depository. According to Dallas Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig, who was on duty in Dealey Plaza that day, within 30 minutes, Oswald somehow slipped out of the place unchallenged, walked 4 blocks east on Elm Street, caught a bus back west through heavy traffic for 2 blocks, got off the bus and walked 2 more blocks west before turning south on Lamar Street. After walking 4 blocks and having a brief conversation with a woman and a cab driver over the use of the cab, the taxi takes him to 500 North Beckley Street. But the boarding house where he lived was located at 1026 North Beckley. He had to walk to the rooming house in order to pick something up suggested to be a jacket or a handgun or both. And if that is not enough, said Craig, the housekeeper where Oswald lived testified that at 1:05 p.m. he was waiting for a bus in front of his rooming house. Finally, to make him the fastest man on earth, he walked to East 10th Street and Patton Street, several blocks away, and killed Officer J.D. Tippit between 1:05 and 1:08 p.m. This man had to be stopped. He was the most dangerous criminal in the history of the world. Here was a man who was able to go from one location to another with the swiftness of Superman, to change his physical characteristics at will, and who pumped 4 automatic slugs into a police officer with a revolver. Indeed, a master criminal. Lee Harvey Oswald was born on October 18, 1939, 2 months after his father had died of a heart attack while mowing the lawn. His father, Robert Edward Lee Oswald Sr., served as a sergeant in the U.S. Army during World War I. Is said to be the 3rd cousin of President Theodore Roosevelt, as well as a distant cousin of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The Warren Commission's summary of Oswald's youth painted a very dark and ominous picture of his childhood, claiming that Lee has to be seen as an emotionally quite disturbed youngster who suffers under the impact of really existing emotional isolation and deprivation, lack of affection, absence of family life, and rejection by a self-involved and conflicted mother. Although Lee's mother insisted that he had a normal childhood and was very happy in his youth, telling CBS in 1964,
he was a happy-go-lucky youngster, actually. He had a dog. He had a bicycle. He belonged to the Y. He used to go to the Y and go swimming. I know many a time while at work he'd come in to see me from the Y, wringing wet, and it'd be in the wintertime. And I'd tell him he was going to catch cold because his hair was still wet, like all boys. He wouldn't dry himself thoroughly. He loved to play Monopoly. He knew any and everything there was to know about animals. He studied animals, was often in the zoo, and as we know, he was picked up in the Bronx Zoo while in New York playing hooky from school. And I consider that normal also, playing hooky from school. Many, many boys do this. We know, and it's sad and unfortunate, that Lee was deprived of his father, and he was born 2 months after his father had expired. But we must understand that Lee had 2 brothers, so he was not raised just with a woman alone.
Mrs. Oswald, how old was Lee when he went in the Marine Corps?
Lee was exactly 17 years old when he went in the Marine Corps. He enlisted on his birthday.
Mrs. Oswald, why do you think your son went to Russia?
I think my son was sent to Russia. You see, Lee knew Russian fluently, read and write. He filed an application for Albert Schweitzer School, and on the application, I have an original application, it stated that I speak and write Russian.
Where did he learn this?
This is what I was going to tell you. He learned this while in the Marines, because Lee was in the Marines and only out 3 days when he went to Russia. So Lee had to learn this while in the Marines.
What did you think about your son marrying a Russian girl?
Well, to me, a Russian girl, any foreign girl, a Negro, or just any human being live and breathe just like I do. And so it made no difference to me that he married a Russian girl. I believe that Lee was told to marry the Russian girl. He probably loved her and was going with her because he knew her 6 weeks when he married her. But I think that he had orders from the State Department to marry the Russian girl.
Mrs. Oswald, do you feel that your son was an agent of the CIA?
Yes, it's not that I feel that he was an agent of the CIA. It's because I have so much correspondence with the State Department, plus the letters that Lee wrote to me from Russia, that indicates that he was an agent of our government, definitely.
After watching his mother provide a polar opposite perspective to the dark portrait painted all throughout the Warren Report, I began to feverishly fertilize the seeds of doubt I already had firmly planted in my mind surrounding the official story of the life and motives of the man we know as Lee Harvey Oswald. By 1944, almost 5 years after the birth of Lee in New Orleans' Old French Hospital, Marguerite Oswald moved the family to Dallas, Texas, where she would remarry for only 2 years. In August 1952, Lee and his mother went to New York City to stay with her son from a previous marriage, John Edward Pick, who at the time was a staff sergeant in the Coast Guard working port security at Ellis Island, living at an apartment on East 92nd Street. John was newly married to his 18-year-old wife named Marge, and they just had a baby boy who was only 3 months old when 12-year-old Lee and their mother came to visit. And according to author Vincent Bugliosi, the visit was going very well with the young couple, seemingly bonding with Lee during this time until their mother made it clear she intended on staying with them permanently. This is when things became turbulent, after Marge voiced her rejection of the idea, which John seemed to agree with. Lee had been enrolled in the 7th grade at an evangelical Lutheran school, but within a month he already had such bad attendance he was forced to enroll in a junior high school in the Bronx. This is when Bugliosi writes that half-brother John began to see a shift in disposition in Lee's home life, claiming that a once well-behaved young boy had a newly acquired disrespect for authority, even growing somewhat hostile toward John and their mother. This all led to an unfortunate crescendo when Marge explained an incident where Lee threatened her with a pocket knife. And a few days later, Lee and his mother would move into a basement apartment on Sheridan Avenue. According to the Warren Commission report, truancy charges were brought against young Lee, stating that he was beyond the control of his mother insofar as school attendance is concerned. On April 16th to May 7th, 1953, Lee was sent to an institution for child psychiatric evaluation called Youth House. It was there that he was found to exhibit higher than normal intelligence for his age, scoring a 118 on his IQ test, and showing no signs of neurological impairment or mental illness. Evelyn Siegel, a social worker who interviewed both Lee and his mother at Youth House, described a rather pleasant, appealing quality about this emotionally starved, affectionless youngster which grows as one speaks to him, and found that he had detached himself from the world around him because no one in it ever met any of his needs for love. It also states in the Warren Commission report that when Lee returned to school for the fall semester in 1953, he continued to act out, failing to cooperate with school authorities to such a degree that they even considered placing him in a boys' home. His behavior improved significantly after this threat, postponing the potential placement. And as the story goes, in January 1954, Lee and his mother left New York before the family court system could address the case. Here's where our story takes another sharp turn off the beaten path of the official narrative. After returning to New Orleans, Lee would finish the 9th grade before leaving school, where they claim he went to work for a year before joining the Marines in October 1956 at 17. In almost every official report about Oswald, this year of his life is either left completely unmentioned or casually glossed over as an irrelevant detail unimportant to the case. However, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison launched an investigation in 1967 into the Kennedy assassination that uncovered direct links from Oswald to David Ferrie and Clay Shaw. Coincidentally, this unaccounted for year where Lee is reported to be off working, in reality, he had joined David Ferrie's squadron in the Civil Air Patrol at Moisant Airport in 1955. The Civil Air Patrol was formed in 1941 by David Harold Byrd, who was still in charge of the Louisiana and Texas regions of the Civil Air Patrol at the time Oswald was recruited by Squadron Commander David Ferry. David Harold Byrd was a Texas oil man known for being a member of what was considered a right-wing group called the 8F Crowd, or the Sweet 8F Group. This was a network of politically active businessmen in Texas since at least the 1930s, consisting of many prominent members, including Governor of Texas John Connally and even Lyndon B. Johnson, who was reported to be a close personal friend with David Harold Byrd. Not only was David Byrd responsible for forming the Civil Air Patrol that connected Oswald with all of these notable players who would later be involved with the assassination plot, he also owned the Texas School Book Depository, the very location where Oswald worked and was reported to have fired the lethal shots at Kennedy on Friday, November 22, 1963. While in the Louisiana Cap, as we mentioned in our previous episode, Lee would even meet a young 16-year-old Barry Seal on a 2-week joint training exercise. David Ferry would claim on the record that he never knew Lee Harvey Oswald, and even called Garrison's inquiry an utter waste of time, although almost a decade and a half later, the House Select Committee on Assassinations conducted an investigation that would find at least 6 witnesses who said that Oswald had been present at Civil Air Patrol meetings ran by Ferry. By November 1993, PBS Frontline obtained a group photograph taken in 1955, 8 years before the assassination, clearly showing a teenage Lee Harvey Oswald with David Ferry and 8 other Civil Air Patrol cadets attending a cookout at David Ferry's house. In less than a year after his time with the New Orleans Cap, Oswald would join the Marine Corps on October 24, 1956, just a week after his 17th birthday. Based on a report by the Philadelphia publication The Saturday Evening Post, like all Marines, Oswald was trained and tested in shooting. In December 1956, he scored a .212, which was slightly above the requirements for the designation of sharpshooter. But nearly 3 years later, he was reduced to a marksman after scoring a .191 in May of 1959. According to the Warren Commission report, his primary training was in radar operation, which required a security clearance, and stated in a document from May 1957, he was granted final clearance to handle classified matter up to and including confidential. The President's Commission reported that Oswald finished 7th in a class of 30 in the Aircraft Control and Warning Operator course, which included instruction in aircraft surveillance and the use of radar. His assigned MOS was Aviation Electronics Operator. While he was stationed in California, he met who would later become the co-founder of a religion called Discordianism, named Kerry Thornley. Thornley was a fellow Marine that also authored the only book written about Oswald before the assassination, called The Idle Warriors, and was apparently a work of fiction written in 1962 about a disgruntled Marine who defects to the Soviet Union. After the assassination, Thornley was asked to testify before the Warren Commission for much more than this oddly incriminating work of fiction. According to journalist John Simpkin at Spartacus Educational, the book was based on Thornley's knowledge of Oswald. The following year, Thornley moved to New Orleans, where it was claimed he associated with Guy Bannister, David Ferry, and Clay Shaw. Oswald was also living in the city at that time, but Thornley insisted that the 2 men never met during this period. The 2 men were also both in Mexico City, September 1963. Jim Garrison later claimed that Thornley and Lee Harvey Oswald were involved together in covert CIA operations. He also argued that Thornley had impersonated Oswald between the years 1961 and 1963. In his book On the Trail of the Assassins, Garrison insists that Thornley was friends with another possible conspirator, Johnny Rosselli. In 1992, Thornley appeared on a television program, A Current Affair. He confessed that he had been part of a conspiracy to assassinate John F. Kennedy. However, he did not give the names of his fellow conspirators. Harry Wendell Thornley died in 1998. He had been working on a book with the journalist Sandra London. The book, Confession to Conspiracy to Assassinate JFK, and was published in 2000. In August 1957, about a month after reporting to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California, Oswald was shipped off to top-secret naval air facility at Sugi, near Tokyo, Japan, where he was assigned to Marine Air Control Squadron 1. According to author Gerald Posner in his book Case Closed, Oswald was court-martialed after he accidentally shot himself in the elbow with an unauthorized .22 caliber handgun. He was court-martialed a second time for fighting with the sergeant he thought was responsible for his punishment in the shooting matter. He was subsequently demoted from private first class to private and briefly imprisoned. Oswald was later punished for a third incident. While he was on a nighttime sentry duty in the Philippines, he inexplicably fired his rifle into the jungle. By November 1958, Oswald was transferred back to El Toro, where his unit's function was aircraft surveillance and the training of both enlisted men and officers alike for later assignments overseas. Now we must address the controversy surrounding Lee's advanced Russian linguistic skills. The official narrative would have us believe that while Oswald was in the Marines, he taught himself rudimentary Russian, although there is evidence of an unusual request on February 25, 1959, when he was invited to take a Marine proficiency exam in written and spoken Russian, according to an article at The Intercept written by Ryan Grimm. Among the intersections between Oswald and the CIA, his time as a young Marine at the Atsugi Naval Air Facility in Japan in 1957 is high among them. Atsugi was a launching pad for U-2 spy flights over the Soviet Union and was also a hub of the CIA's research into psychedelic drugs. A CIA memo titled Truth, Drugs, and Interrogation revealed the agency practice of dosing agents who were marked for dangerous overseas missions, wrote author David Talbot in The Devil's Chessboard, his 2015 biography of former CIA Director Alan Dulles. Talbot's exploration of the link ended there. Some chroniclers of Oswald's life have suggested that he was one of the young Marines on whom the CIA performed its acid tests. Oswald's next few years make much more sense with a connection to the CIA than without them. After studying Russian while in the military, perhaps trained at the Army Language School in Monterey, California, according to Talbot, sourcing the claim to the Warren Commission Chief Counsel J. Lee Rankin, Oswald was discharged with a false claim of his mother's ill health, completely broke with only $203 in his bank account. He took a boat to England 9 days after his discharge. Then, according to his wife, Oswald took a military transport flight to Finland, staying at 2 of the nicest hotels in Helsinki. Oswald then took an overnight train from Helsinki to Moscow. Once there, he presented himself at the U.S. Embassy to announce he'd become a defector. Embassy staff later recalled that his defection speech sounded odd and rehearsed. He spent 2.5 years in the Soviet Union and then, just as curiously as he'd defected, returned home to the United States. If the series of moves, from the discharge to the flight to the defection to the return, were made at the behest of the CIA, they make sense, with Oswald playing some type of role in the inscrutable world of spycraft. Absent an intelligence link, the tick-tock of Oswald's post-military years would be situated somewhere between extraordinarily implausible, to impossible to pull off. In the 1970s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations uncovered internal CIA documents confirming the existence of what they called the Fake Defector Program, which was a part of a larger covert intelligence operation attempting to run sheep-dipped assets into the Soviet Union all throughout the 1950s. Many people suspect that Oswald was sent into the Soviet Union during this time as a part of this fake defector program, given the fact that he never actually renounced his American citizenship. He was also meant to engage in what's called a dangle, which is an espionage term used within the intelligence community to refer to an agent or officer of one intelligence agency or group who pretends to be interested in defecting or turning to another intelligence agency or group. The goal of a dangle is to convince the second or foreign intelligence agency that they have changed loyalties by offering to act as a double agent. The dangle then feeds information to their original agency and or gives disinformation to the second or foreign intelligence agency. The only problem is that it seems Oswald was given real workable intelligence as a part of his dangle operation while defecting to the Soviet Union in 1959. In the 1966 book, Legend, The Secret World of Lee Harvey Oswald, the author puts forward evidence suggesting that Oswald had either learned or been given key performance data on the CIA's U-2 spy plane while serving as a Marine radar controller at the top secret base in Atsugi, Japan. Upon his defection, he allegedly provided information to the Soviets, enabling them to redesign their rocket guidance systems so as to knock CIA pilot Gary Powers out of the air over the Soviet Union on May 1, 1960, just in time to strategically collapse any hope for the Paris Peace Summit, meant to ease tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. The idea is that a large faction within the United States intelligence apparatus were keen on ratcheting up the Cold War, and putting an end to the Peace Summit had become a top priority. After the reveal of the U-2 spy plane, Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev lashed out at President Eisenhower, accusing him of lying and not acting in good faith during their attempted negotiations. In episode 287 of the Corbett Report with James Corbett, investigative journalist, author, and esteemed researcher Lisa Peace provides a thorough explanation in regard to Oswald's time spent in the Soviet Union.
He gets a flight to Europe, and the War Commission tries to track how he pays for it. Well, he doesn't have any money to pay for this long flight that goes, through Switzerland and then on to Finland, and they never could explain, which flights he took, how he paid for it. And the fact that he went to Finland to get into the Soviet Union is also significant because it's one of the few places where you can get in very quickly. A lot of times it takes weeks to get a pass to get into Russia at that point in time, especially for a so-called civilian. You can't just walk up to the border, show a passport, and walk through. A highly closed society. But in Finland, Oswald goes there. He stays at what is the equivalent of the Ritz-Carlton. So this poor kid with no money, somehow gets this flight and ends up at a 5-star hotel and then gets into the Soviet Union the very next day. I mean, all of these circumstances make no sense if he's who the war reports say he is. But they make perfect sense if he's an intelligence agent on assignment. And again, as far as the various levels of intelligence agents, one of the things that CIA people did was run singleton operations, meaning you weren't part of a team, you weren't part of a group. Some CIA agent basically ran you on a personal basis, kind of out of their back pocket. And another CIA person who was in that category, Jerry Patrick Hemming, who for the most part I don't consider very credible, but I do think he was credible on this point. He did say that James Jesus Angleton, the head of the CIA's counterintelligence for 25 years, was running singleton operations into the Soviet Union. All right. We also know the CIA at that time was running a false defector program. Because again, just on the face of it, who wants to defect from free America to closed society, dictatorship, communist KGB USSR at that point in time. No one in their right mind would choose to leave the free country of America to go live in a closed society. It just doesn't happen. And the Soviets knew that. So every time one of these defectors arrived, the Soviets would talk to them, figure they were CIA spooks, try and get whatever information they could out of them, and eventually send them back. Oswald was kind of in the middle of a pack of American so-called defectors who went over there. And again, the Warren Commission just tells us flat out he defected. John Newman, on the other hand, a former intelligence analyst, went through the actual files, every single thing on Oswald, and he pointed out to the rest of us, he's like, hey, Oswald never actually defected. He would have had to sign this, he would have had to do that, and he specifically didn't. So he claimed to defect, but he didn't really defect. He never gave up his U.S. citizenship. And then I noticed, even in the Warren Commission documents, how did he get back from the Soviet Union? He came back on a military hop. So again, we have this guy who supposedly, he provably worked on the base where the U-2 flights were flying. He had top secret information, goes to the Soviet Union, says he's going to defect, and yet he's still welcomed back to America, not only with open arms, but on a military flight. He gets a loan from the State Department when he gets back. I mean, it's incredible on the face of it if the official story is true. But again, if he's an intelligence agent, none of this is crazy. All of this makes perfect sense.
In the President's Commission report, they claim that in January 1961, Oswald had written in his personal diary, "I'm starting to reconsider my desire about staying. The work is drab, the money I get has nowhere to be spent. No nightclubs or bowling alleys, no places of recreation except the trade union dances. I have had enough." Within 2 months, he's meant to have met Marina Pruskova, who was a 19-year-old pharmacology student living with her uncle at the time of their introduction. During this time, her uncle, Ilya Pruskova, was working as a colonel in the Soviet Union's Ministry of Internal Affairs. 6 weeks after they first met, the couple would marry, and the official narrative would state that Oswald soon became disillusioned with life in the Soviet Union, and in June 1962, he was given priority permission to return to the United States. Much later, it was revealed that a memo had been written by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover on June 3, 1960, 8 months after Oswald had defected to Russia, in which he claims to be aware of a Lee Harvey Oswald in the Soviet Union, as well as another Lee Harvey Oswald still operating in the United States using the very same identity. The memo was addressed to the Office of Security at the State Department and included the Director of Naval Intelligence with the subject line reading, "Lee Harvey Oswald, Internal Security." In the memo, Director Hoover writes, "Your attention is directed to the report of Special Agent John W. Fain, Dallas, Texas, dated May 12, 1960, entitled, 'Funds Transmitted to Residents of Russia, Internal Security-R,' a copy of which was furnished to the Department of State on May 24, 1960. In that report, you will note that subject's mother, Mrs. Marguerite Oswald, Fort Worth, Texas, advised that she recently received a letter addressed to her son from the Albert Schweitzer College in Switzerland indicating that Lee Oswald was expected at the college on April 20, 1960. She stated subject had taken his birth certificate with him when he left home. She was apprehensive about his safety because 3 letters she had written him since January 22, 1960, have been returned to her undelivered. Since there is a possibility that an impostor is using Oswald's birth certificate, any current information the Department of State may have concerning subject will be appreciated." After spending significant time attempting to track the reported movements of this Oswald impostor, testimonies given to the House Select Committee on Assassinations pointed to multiple witnesses interacting and dealing with a man calling himself Lee Oswald several times during 1960 and 1961. One recorded instance was a witness account from a woman named Marita Lorenz, who claimed that She met Lee Oswald at a safe house in Miami and interacted with him many times at CIA training camps in the Florida Everglades. A congresswoman responsible for financing Cuban exile groups in the early 1960s, named Claire Booth, said she was told that Oswald and others were involved in infiltration of communist groups in the area. The manager of Bolton Ford Truck Center in New Orleans, named Fred Sewell, claimed he met with a couple of men on January 20th, 1961, one of which called himself Lee Oswald. They said they wanted to buy trucks to send to Cuba and were given a written proposal with a sales order form listing the purchaser as Friends of Democratic Cuba, as well as the name Oswald. The FDC only existed from January 6, 1961, to the third week of March 1961, and Guy Bannister was reported to have been on the board of directors as well as drawing up the charter for the organization. Before we completely disregard the official narrative surrounding the movements of Oswald at the time of his return from the Soviet Union, we should reflect on what's supposed to have happened during the 10 months he settles in Dallas before returning to New Orleans. In the summer of 1962, Lee Harvey Oswald was supposed to have befriended a 51-year-old man by the name of George de Montchild, who had just recently moved to the Dallas area in October of 1961. De Montchild was born in a part of the old Russian Empire that has become modern-day Belarus, but had been described as an American petroleum geologist, anti-communist political refugee, professor, and occasional CIA field agent. He's allegedly a PGU officer who collected military intelligence and was potentially responsible for foreign operations and intelligence activities by providing for the training and management of covert agents. He also would be the individual who gave one of the longest testimonies to the Warren Commission, personally tying the Carcano rifle to Oswald that would officially be considered the only murder weapon and one of the weakest claims of the overall case in general. This man has been considered by many to be Oswald's handler during his time in Dallas, and he also was the individual who somehow convinced the Warren Commission that Oswald played a role in the attempted assassination of General Edwin Walker. In July 1962, Oswald was hired on as a sheet metal worker in Dallas, but that would only last for 3 months because he reportedly disliked the work. The Warren Commission hearings would show that on October 12th, he started work as a photo print trainee at a graphic arts company. Although he would be fired within the first 6 months, and employees of the company would testify to the toxic work environment he caused with his rude behavior, even claiming that fights threatened to break out over his poor conduct. 3 weeks after he was fired, he's reported to have moved back to New Orleans on April 24th, 1963. It wasn't until a month later when Ruth Payne would drive Marina Oswald down from Dallas to join Lee in New Orleans. The Payne family had been introduced to the Oswalds by George de Montchild, and Ruth's husband, Michael Payne, apparently worked for Bell Helicopter. On May 10th, Oswald would be hired by the Riley Coffee Company as a machinery greaser, only lasting 2 months because he reportedly spent too much time loitering in Adrian Alba's garage next door. However, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison claimed in his 1988 book On the Trail of the Assassins that Oswald really spent that time across the street at 544 Camp Street. These were the law offices of Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent, an avid segregationist, and a former naval intelligence officer. Garrison continued saying that Guy Bannister, during the summer of 1963 in New Orleans, was most interested in infiltrating the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and used Oswald as his spy.
6 months before the assassination, Oswald had taken a mundane job with the Riley Coffee Company, but it seems his real activities were centered a few blocks away. From a small office on the corner of Lafayette and Camp Street, Oswald managed a local chapter of the pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Operating from an adjoining office was a sinister figure named Guy Bannister.
About Guy Bannister, it's difficult to say much about him because he always stood in the shadows and pushed someone else to the front. He was a strongly disciplined man, perhaps the outgrowth of his many years as a special agent in charge of the Chicago office of the FBI. But he was a key man in the assassination. And that's clear from the fact that Oswald's sheep-dipping, his being portrayed as a communist, was done out of Guy Bannister's office. So he was sheep-dipped for months as a communist by given literature. Lee, hand this out today. This is your assignment. I came across the fact that Oswald, a private in the Marines, had taken a Russian examination. And I knew the privates did not take Russian examinations unless they were connected with intelligence. So that caused me to be curious about 544 Camp, which was the address stamped on one circular that they gave out one time before, obviously, Bannister told him, Lee, no more addresses. It turned out that was a side address of Guy Bannister's private detective agency. Well, I went down there to look at it, and I found myself not merely outside of Guy Bannister's office, but across the street from Naval Intelligence, across the street from Secret Service. Around the corner was the Crescent City garage, the garage for the intelligence community. And then 2 doors away, the Riley Coffee Company. I used to be in the FBI. I knew people in Naval Intelligence, and they were either across the street, around the corner. The whole intelligence community was there, and right in the middle of it was Guy Bannister having Oswald sheep-dipped as a communist.
You're a Marxist? Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries which adhere to leftist or Marxist principles.
In your work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what are you advocating?
We advocate restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba.
The Warren Commission states that while operating the pro-Castro FPCC out of Guy Bannister's office, he paid a visit to the anti-Castro militant Carlos Brignier on August 5th and 6th, who was the New Orleans delegate for the DRE, an anti-Castro organization. On August 9th, Brignier claimed to be tipped off by a friend that Oswald was spotted in downtown New Orleans handing out pro-Castro leaflets. After a fight broke out, Brignier, Oswald, and 2 others were arrested for disturbing the peace, and the arresting officer would claim that he believed the entire incident had been staged. The President's Commission states that prior to leaving the police station, Oswald requested to speak with an FBI agent, and a week later, a local New Orleans TV station, WDSU, filmed Oswald passing out FPCC leaflets in front of the International Trade Mart founded in 1946 by Clay Shaw. 2 months before the assassination, Marina Oswald and her child were taken to the Payne household near Dallas, Texas, after Ruth Payne drove them up from New Orleans. Someone calling themselves Oswald, who could barely speak Russian at all, was meant to have caught a bus on September 26th from Houston to Mexico City. The President's Commission stated that he had told other passengers on the bus that he planned on traveling to Cuba via Mexico. The Warren Commission would later conclude that Oswald had visited Mexico City and the Cuban and Soviet consulates. Questions regarding whether someone posing as Oswald had appeared at the embassies were serious enough to be investigated by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, who could not rule out the possibility that someone else had used his name in visiting the consulates. The official story places Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas by October 3rd, 1963, and the final report of the President's Commission claims that on October 14th, Ruth Payne found out about a job opening from her neighbor that she mentioned to Oswald. 2 days later, he would be hired as a minimum wage order filler at the Texas School Book Depository. So who was the real Lee Harvey Oswald? He was a sheep-dipped Special Forces operator working for naval intelligence, and when he thought he was infiltrating the FPCC in New Orleans, he was actually signing his own death warrant, placing the breadcrumbs to a sophisticated trail only meant to lead back to one man, an operator hung out to dry as a patsy, to be sacrificed at the altar of the imperial war machine.